Madame Blavatsky said, and I've quoted this a couple of times already in the short time I've been here, is that orthodoxy in theosophy is neither desirable nor possible. Yet there are those of us amongst us who believe this not to be the case. Anyway, as theosophists, we possibly pride ourselves on having open minds and the ability to think for ourselves, and I think many of us do. But in some cases that's more aspirational than actual. And we do have people who develop very closed minds. But also, because of the nature of what we do, we also have some very notable free thinkers. And it's this idea of free thinking that I really want to explore in this short talk this afternoon. I mean, I've always regarded myself as a passionate seeker of truth, which is why I made the very misguided choice 50 years ago to become a journalist, because I believed it was a genuinely good thing to do. I believed it was a mission to explain and a mission to tell the truth. And I thought it was a noble profession of independent-minded people seeking out this truth. Well, now I know that I was completely wrong about that. I think in the days when I started it was about that. Now it's just about propaganda, hypocrisy and lies and fake news and tittle-tattle and all sorts of other things. However, I did my best, and I didn't know then what I do know now, so there we are. So free thinking is not only absolutely central to our own personal psycho-spiritual development and evolution, but also that of the planet and the cosmos itself. We can't constrict thought, because the universe consists only of consciousness, nothing else. We can't constrict that. So we have to, wherever we can, resist those forces which oppose freedom and freedom of thought, because these forces are essentially anti-evolutionary, and we as an organization and as individuals are very pro-evolutionary. Throughout history, free thinking has always been something of a minority pursuit, a bit like collecting Victorian teapots or train spotting. Very few people engaged in it down the ages. Why? Well, because the risks were enormous and the rewards were minimal. As I say, we know that there's nothing but consciousness and one life in one form or another in this infinite, eternal and boundless universe of ours. The human kingdom of nature in which we're involved plays a pivotal role in this, how this consciousness develops and how it unfolds, how it's controlled, and the influence it has, especially on this, the material plane of existence. The human kingdom is central. It's the kingdom through which all other kingdoms of nature have passed or will pass. It's the great possessor and processor of consciousness. So we have the potential to be thinking beings, and we've come a long way in this human project as we've evolved through various stages of development. And ultimately we have the opportunity to become totally free-thinking beings. But most of us, for one reason or not, haven't reached that stage just yet. Real thinking remains very much a latent capacity in many people. Many of us have got control of our physical bodies and to some extent of our emotional and astral bodies, but controlling our minds is still a huge challenge. It's a work in progress. And one of the problems we face at the moment is that our thinking is being overshadowed to a very large degree by lots and lots of invasive technologies. And we're developing a huge over-reliance on these technologies, and this doesn't make any things easier because it's not helping us personally to evolve. We mentioned last night the dangers of transhumanism, of bolting bits of machinery onto human beings to create super robots. And although this might just be a science fiction fear, I do think it's something we need to take into account. And we have people amongst us who really want to make us more reliant on this technology. And that is against free thinking, it's against our free will. So, as some of you will know, my role in all this ageless wisdom stuff is to try and make these ideas and these laws as clear as I possibly can. I also want to make them concise and accessible and understandable as possible, but also practical. A lot of people think that the wisdom we have is purely theoretical and can't be applied in our lives, but it can. But again, we need freedom of thought in which to apply these ideas. I think we can use these teachings with the right mental outlook to really enhance and improve our lives. So free thinking is never easy. It's never been easy. In the past, it could get you killed. These days, it can see you assassinated on social media, or otherwise rejected and reviled for an opinion you happen to have held. We're living in very dangerous times. I don't need to tell you that, but we are living in extremely dangerous times, and we have to really resist those forces which want to homogenize all ideas, control those ideas, and therefore, by doing that, to control us. We're obliged, as Theosophists, in my opinion, to oppose mental totalitarianism wherever we encounter it. And we do encounter it all the time. Equally, you can't really be a free thinker if you're frightened of being rejected or ridiculed. And rejection and ridicule are two of the main weapons that people use these days. But free thinking is actually about rejecting rejection. Free thinking is never mainstream. You can never run with the pack, because the pack's always running in a different direction. And sometimes free thinking means being in a minority of one. A great many people go through life never really having any original ideas at all. The minds are inevitably shaped by other people's opinions and thoughts and assertions. In fact, the vast majority of us are never brave enough to develop our own ideas, either because we haven't got the ability to do that, or to locate or generate those ideas, or we simply can't be bothered, or, as I've said, because we're too frightened. And fear does play a great part in all this, as we shall see. Usually it's more a case of fear of what other people think about us. And we're all very conscious of this, and we've never been as conscious of being ridiculed or being ostracized, because nobody really wants to be on the outside looking in, apart from a few brave souls. But one of the key aspects of being a free thinker is actually learning about the nature of fear itself and learning how to eliminate it from your emotions. We shouldn't really be prepared to tolerate fear. And apart from anything else, when you actually look at it, fear is usually quite groundless. It's usually based on all sorts of overblown assertions that we have, and we imagine all sorts of things are going to happen which never materialize. And so we get sucked into this cycle of fear, and it's very, very hard to break free of it. So in any given time, in any given age, and we are the exception to this, of course, people don't want to step out of line. Particularly times like this that we're living through, there are some very, very authoritarian currents running through the world at the moment in all sorts of different ways. So it's easier for many people just to kind of knuckle down and accept the majority view, however grotesque or however absurd that majority view happens to be. And this is true of social, political, religious, or commercial organizations. And it's especially true of the workplace and the educational system. It seems that plurality of thought is being flattened out in all sorts of ways. And this brings us to one of the gravest threats, in my opinion, to humanity at any given time. And this is as great as war, famine, and environmental despoliation. And we're talking about political correctness here. Getting the masses to toe the line, whoever the masses happen to be. People who think that you can be told what to think, what to say, what to feel. And let's not forget that the prevailing opinions and attitudes of a society at any given time are usually at the very least misguided and often criminally wrong. And we're living in times where this is no exception. You don't need me to tell you that societies have never liked rebels, freethinkers, dissidents, or anyone who rocks the boat. They're ridiculed, sidelined, banished, punished, and often killed, either by the dominant religion of the time, by the state, or by the mob, or by a combination of all three. Historically, Christianity has been especially gifted at this type of repression, with its crusades, invasions, inquisitions, witch burnings, and the wholesale destruction of individuals who dared to challenge its authority. In 2 centuries, the Catholic Church murdered more than 2 million women whom it suspected of sorcery because they happened to live in a crumbling, isolated cottage with a couple of black cats. A bit like my own domestic situation, really. Those heretics who challenged the prevailing wisdom and the orthodoxy suggested, for example, that the earth might actually revolve around the sun, and that the earth wasn't the center of the universe. Men like Giordano Bruno, who were burnt at the stake for suggesting such alternative truths. And yet we know that something that's very far out in one generation becomes accepted by the next, and the generation after that wonders how people could never have believed this in the first place. But it always takes a few brave souls to break that mold and stand up and be counted. But even now, institutions like the Catholic Church have still got a great many prohibitions and mortal and venal sins. And of course these days it enforces its long list of orthodoxies with more subtle and psychological methods than the rack and the hot pliers which it preferred in the past. According to the Vatican, one of the worst sins that it's possible to commit is to speculate even about what might have happened before God woke up one morning and decided to create the universe. And don't forget this, that the Inquisition still exists. These days it goes under the more innocuous title of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And if that's not a piece of euphemistic language, I don't know what is. So you better be warned, if you start thinking about what happened before this supposed Big Bang, you might get some of those hard men from the Vatican knocking on your door and dragging you off to the nearest torture chamber, so be warned. And of course there are other sinister shock troops as well in the form of the Jesuits or Opus Dei. You see, religions don't want you to think for yourself. This is dangerous to them. Religions are for children. Religions are not the natural habitat these days for true spiritual seekers. And I'm sad to have to say that. These days there are some perverted minorities within Islam who've assumed the global role of executioner-in-chief for those who disobey their many tyrannical doctrines. Another thing that I'm very sad to have to say is that during my lifetime, tragically much of it spent as a journalist, I've watched progressively as free speech and expression have been continuously attacked and eroded. And these are through the forces of political correctness. And I'll deal with this toxic topic in just a moment. But people in this country, when I was a child, people used to pride themselves on their free expression. Do you remember how people used to say, I totally disagree with what you have to say, but I would fight to the death for your right to say it? How many people say that now? Very, very few. So, this idea that people can say things without fear of repression or ridicule has actually been consigned to the wastebasket of history. So let's get on to this ugly topic of political correctness. I think being PC is entirely incompatible with being a spiritual explorer, or indeed a theosophical adventurer, because you're living life through someone else's rules, through someone else's language. You're living your life via people who can tell you what to think, what to read, what not to read, names that can be mentioned and can't be mentioned. And this indeed is a very, very dangerous precedent. The current form of political correctness that we have in this country and the rest of the world actually started 80 or 90 years ago. And it's actually more to do, it's more accurately described as Marxist manipulation of language, which is what it is. You make people feel ashamed for using certain words. And to keep them confused, you keep changing that vocabulary so they're never very comfortable with that language, and they always feel out of step, they always feel on the back foot. And today, much of the source of all this stuff is in our revered academic institutions. This is where a lot of this poison is formulated. Luckily, theosophy and academia have never really hit it off in that close way, so I think we're certainly protected from that. But you have the really grotesque situation where a Nobel laureate makes a few misguided remarks at a conference and comes back to his post at university to find himself sacked by a bunch of zealots. This is completely wrong. So this is why I regard political correctness as not only a huge brake on people's psycho-spiritual development, but almost as a malignant disease, a manipulative cancer of the mind. Someone quite close to my heart and to Wayne's as well, a chap called David Icke, you either love him or you hate him. He described splendidly political correctness as the moronic silencing the intelligent, and I think that's exactly what it is. And political correctness, as I've tried to indicate, I think is the ultimate crime against free thinking. I mean, would you have wanted to be politically correct in Hitler's Germany, or Stalin's Russia, or in Mao Zedong's China? Of course you wouldn't. But we see now that it's, we've got to be politically correct. People say, it's not very PC. Good. I'm glad it's not very PC, because we do need people to think for themselves. Can you imagine that if Madame Blavatsky had followed the prevailing lines of thought of her day, we wouldn't be sitting here. There would be no theosophy. It would never even have been conceived, let alone born. Why? Because theosophy was, and to a great extent it still is, it's so far ahead of the mainstream thought in this world that the ideas and propositions that she was suggesting were literally off the radar. And so she was a magnificent beacon on this road that we're all following. But I'll tell you something, the music didn't die on the 8th of May 1891 when she died. The music continued. And as she said, she wouldn't have wanted to be regarded as the last word on anything. Anyway, so just to repeat myself, I insist that no one has the right to tell anyone else what to do or think or read or anything like that. That is fascism. And that's a word, fascism is a word that the PC Brigade love to bandy about to anybody who disagrees with them. And I have to say that fascism was notably a movement that was connected with right-wing politics. And I think today it's got more to do with left-wing politics. Anyway, I don't want to dwell on politics too much. But whenever we have a prevailing situation in which we have people looking on us like thought police, as in some sort of Orwellian 1984 scenario, this actually works very effectively, because there might only be a few thought police to begin with to say, oh, you can't say this, you can't say that. And what happens is people eventually end up policing themselves. And the result is that it kills free speech and it kills open debate. And if we agree to this, if we adhere to this notion, this enslavement of a manufactured reality, then it's just a form of spiritual cowardice. So, being free-thinking to some extent always means being dissident and rebellious. It always means challenging the prevailing status quo and the predominant wisdom of the day. Because without those brave souls who are prepared to do that, we'd never make any progress whatsoever. Which brings us on to an area which probably and arguably influences modern human thinking more than anything else, science. And its slightly twisted sister, technology, which I love. Now, at the risk of overstating this, I think we are developing a really abusive relationship with this technology. I don't mean that we're abusing it, although we are, but I think the technology is in danger of abusing us. And we have an unhealthy obsession with this technology, and it borders on a kind of fetishism almost. And this technology, which was meant to liberate us, is actually ending up enslaving us and creating a whole raft of addictive behaviors and negative behaviors as well. So the technology is beginning to own us rather than us own and control that technology. And with transhumanism and artificial intelligence, humans morphing into machines, we might well be the ones who ultimately end up being controlled. I hope not. Science today has, as we've discussed many times over the last few days, it's advanced enormously during our lifetimes and during the 20th century. There are more scientists alive now than in the whole of human history. But science has developed its own kind of hubris and dogmatism that the Catholic Church had in the 13th century. Science doesn't like dissidents any better than religions do. Luckily, there are dissidents and rebels within the scientific community who still reject the dominant notions and are prepared to stand up and be counted. People like Rupert Sheldrake. And these people have been pivotal in trying to convince the scientific community that we don't just live in this purely material universe which formed by accident and for no purpose whatsoever. And they've often risked their academic reputations in their bid to tell the truth. Science is a work in progress, but it pretends, like religion, that it has all the answers. Science can't tell us about any of the hows or the whys. Theories such as relativity, the Big Bang, the expanding universe, and various other chunks of the current dogma are regarded as hard and fast laws. They're not. They're theories. They're just the dominant but flawed explanations that we've managed to come up with at the moment. They are not the final truth. There is no final truth. So when science does finally get to grips with the notion that life is eternal and exists everywhere on many levels, which it will eventually, and hopefully soon, then we might finally begin to understand ourselves as human beings and gain a much greater insight into what we're actually doing here and why. Madame Blavatsky said science is our greatest ally, and I think that is still true, but it's also a mainstream enemy of free thinking at the moment. You know, all this business about climate change, unless you are prepared to do research which will come up with the right answers in terms of climate change or other areas, you don't get the research funding, you know, unless you are prepared to give them the answers they particularly want. So science needs many more free thinkers. But nevertheless, I think in our lifetimes, and certainly in the coming generation or two, there's going to be a huge convergence between science and spirituality, and it's already beginning to happen. Now with technology, it's always about money. Money's always in the driving seat. No one really questions about whether these technologies are valid or really useful or beneficial to human beings. They're simply brought out as commercial things to exploit us. We never think for a moment, because we're not free thinkers, we don't think about the effects that these technologies are going to have. Did people look at the car or the television and work out all the things that they were going to bring to us in terms of negatives? No, of course they didn't. No one thinks about the effects. No one thinks about the effects that Wi-Fi and surrounding the world with electromagnetic energy might have on people's long-term health. No one bothers about that because profits are the most important things. But when our great-grandchildren have 2 heads and 6 fingers, they'll be laughing on the other side of their face. On a more psychological level, and this is quite worrying, it's quite worrying when you understand the levels of bad mental health and depression amongst younger and younger people. The rise and rise and rise of social media has made more people feel more unhappy, more dissatisfied with themselves, with their bodies, with their lives, and more disconnected. And this is completely ironic. It's glaringly ironic, because this was meant to actually bring people together, and it's had entirely the opposite effect in many cases. It's a classic illustration of the law of unintended consequences. So if we were less materialistic, and we will over time be forced to become less materialistic whether we like it or not, then, and if we had a greater degree of mental freedom, then we would be much more cautious about building products we almost certainly don't need to satisfy our temporary lusts. And we'd be much more circumspect about the ruinous damage that all this causes to our home, Mother Earth, in that headlong quest for immediate gratification, because that's what it's all about. It's all about immediate gratification. And when it comes to our own development of our spirit and our minds, free thinking isn't just a desirable, optional extra. It's absolutely crucial and central to our own evolution as individual monads. And also, just as importantly, as a brotherhood of humanity. You can't have a brotherhood of humanity that behaves like sheep. So, if we accept the lies and the distortions that we find at any given point in history, a version of events driven by those in control, usually via the unimaginative and the narrow-minded and the bigoted, if we never question the prevailing absurdities and the errors of any society or any organisation or any group of people, then no one ever moves on. We become as immobile as quails pickled in aspic. And this is where, I suppose, the true spiritual seeker has to be of the world, in the world, but not of it. We have to maintain a healthy distance because our ideas are so far in advance of many other people's. Free thinking is something that actually drives the universe, and it's, when you think about it, it's a pure and unpolluting fuel that will never run out. And it'll always take us ultimately to where we want to go. But we have to be prepared to make that sacrifice of putting ourselves out on a limb if we are free thinkers. And if we act as sheep, we'll never progress. We need to act like lions instead. And remember that lions are never worried about what sheep think about them. So free thinking is about being adventurous, it's about being brave. And above all, it's about being able to espouse ideas which are far beyond the common currency of the time. So you also need to be a little bit visionary about all this as well. Theosophists and their kindred spirits have faced this particular battle ever since Madame Blavatsky went public with these timeless esoteric truths back in the 1870s. Although met with huge interest by a small, free-thinking minority, Theosophy, as we know, faced sneering derision and acid-like skepticism from many quarters in its early years. A lot of people just didn't understand it, they just didn't get it. And in some ways, nothing much has changed today, although we've had a huge global influence and we have created ideas which are now percolating into new generations, but people still remain very skeptical about theosophical ideas. So this means that to seriously pursue a theosophical line of thinking inevitably means going against the mainstream mindset, which is still, in the scientific world, almost purely materialistic. When I go out on my long walks in the Pennines with my very non-spiritual friends, I try to tell them that death is a myth, that we're kept alive by nature spirits, and that we came from the moon. And you know what? They think I'm bloody mad. I tell them, no, you're the ones who are misguided, I'm the one who's right, and they just say, look, any more of this and we're going to ring up that man with a straitjacket and get him up here straight away. So it's always a Sisyphus-type struggle getting these ideas across to those who've never questioned the orthodox. With my walking friends, though, if you repeat something often enough, slowly, it gradually begins to work its way through. And one of them confessed to me the other day that he'd actually read a book on reincarnation, but didn't believe it. So, as most of us are aware, every time we think, we create thought forms, either consciously or unconsciously. And many of these thought forms can become extremely solidified and hard to get rid of, even with Silit Bang. And when these thought forms become this dominant and coagulated, they actually produce constricted and static thinking, and they start to dictate behavior in the course of events. And it means that individuals and groups and organizations can all become ensnared by these often very powerful thought forms, which are difficult to dislodge, very difficult to dismantle and destroy. So, as I said a little earlier on, my chief mission in all this ageless wisdom stuff is to try and make it more understandable, accessible and usable. And this means, to some extent, using straightforward language that people can comprehend. And the use of language is very intimately tied up with free thinking. And we shouldn't really use language which is going to alienate people. We shouldn't use language which just mystifies them. And we also suffer the danger when we're dealing with complex ideas of always over-intellectualizing them. And I think there are plenty of people who like to do that, but I think we ought to just pull short of that sometimes. Because we have ideas which are extremely powerful, which have changed our consciousness and which have the potential to change the consciousness of very large numbers of people ultimately. But we can only do that if we can communicate these things effectively. So we have to be free-thinking also in the sense of being open-minded and questioning things without being naive or gullible. And open-mindedness and free-thinking are in some ways inseparable ideas. They're two sides of the same coin and interdependent, and you can't really have one without the other. And that means being as open-minded as we can in our communications about this fascinating body of knowledge which we all love and try to live, and all those accompanying universal laws. One of the dangers that we're always faced with, on any kind of spiritual path, is it doesn't always take very long for quite interesting and vibrant ideas to get frozen into a kind of unimpeachable dogma which can neither be questioned nor challenged. This is the problem that religions have run up against time and time and time again. And this is potentially catastrophic. It's happened virtually to every single spiritual tradition that's ever existed. And when you have this coagulation of ideas, there's no longer any free movement of thought in which to keep these notions alive and which to help them progress. Because we have to progress beyond any ideas we ever have, because this is progress. And so often these ideas fossilize and they grow no further. They recede into oblivion. And then eventually, when the cycle is right, when the time is deemed right, they're revived and brought alive in a more receptive world. So what I'm trying to do in my work is to explain this wisdom in the simplest possible terms that I can, and make it available to a wider cross-section of the public than may have been the case in the past. Frankly, I don't think I've been all that successful at it, but I think we have to keep on trying with this. And given the vigour of the New Age movement, given the interesting ideas which young people are showing, there is a voracious appetite for things occult and esoteric, but they have to be presented to people in the right way. So we have to be, as well as free thinkers, we have to be innovative and we have to be imaginative, and using the resources we have and our money wisely. And given the fact that here we are, mired on this material plane, we have to say, okay, that's where we are, and cooperate with that, and have to be commercially savvy and not financially naive. Now, as many of you know, I've written this book called Cycles of Eternity, which is really trying to simplify these things to a point where a great many people can understand them. And the book's been widely received, but what I hope I haven't done is I hope I haven't done these ideas down to the point where they become meaningless. I've simply tried to give people a taste of what they are, and only people who read this book can be the judge of that. But it's been distributed to more than 40 countries in the world now, and the first edition is almost sold out. Most members of the TS in England, in Scotland, and quite a few in Wales have received it as well. Because if we are going to keep this organisation alive, maybe not with huge numbers of people, we can't rely on the fact that, okay, this 823-page book with 573 word-long sentences and terms that you need a dictionary to understand. We can't rely on this as our means of communication in the future. This stuff is absolutely fascinating and it's wonderful to study. But because so many people are at different stages on this path, we do need to find new ways in which to communicate these ideas to them. And after all, theosophical ideas are not complicated in many instances. They're actually very simple. They're about unity, they're about cycles, they're about reincarnation and karma. They're about a series of universal laws which shape us and everything else. So hopefully there's an ever-widening interest in these ideas and in this wisdom which we've fought so hard to disseminate over the last century and a half. And now it's up to us to tap into that interest and transmit it in ways compatible with where people are at the moment. And that may even mean using social media. Because certainly the ways we've used in the past have worked in their own way, but they're not necessarily very appropriate for today. And people are becoming increasingly wary of organisations of all kinds, be they commercial societies like ours, governments and everything. People are wary of hierarchies, and they see them often as being quite inflexible and often quite arrogant and distant from people. So we need to think about how we as an organisation communicate with those who may be ready to accept our ideas. So finally, what I would say is that maybe we need to regard Theosophy not so much as an organisation, although it is, but more as a set of ideas, a dynamic set of ideas and a thought movement. And it's, for me and for many of you, it's a way of life. The way of life of the free thinker. And so, if we regard these ideas as living, dynamic, comprehensive, coherent and credible, and if we can preserve those ideas and keep our thoughts original and not allow people to tell us what to think and what to read and what to do, then I think we're on a reasonable path. Thank you very much.